right, welcome everybody to this panel on Harms and Hopes, the Myriad Injustices of Pornography, hosted by Students for Child-Oriented Policy. Our first speaker tonight will be Dr. William Struthers. He's a professor of psychology at Wheaton College, where he investigates the clinical and neurological issues surrounding compulsive pornography use. Dr. Struthers is the author of Wired for Intimacy: How Pornography Hijacks the Male Brain, and is internationally known for his advocacy work against pornography. His lab research interests are in the neural mechanisms that underlie behavioral arousal and the processing of novel environments. His professional memberships include the Society for Neuroscience, Faculty for Undergraduate Neuroscience, Association for the Psychological Science, and the International Neuroethics Society. Dr. Struthers married his wife in 1993, and they have been blessed with 3 children. Our second speaker is Dawn Hawkins. She is a passionate defender of human rights who has dedicated her life to fighting against societal harms that threaten the dignity of others. Her energy, creativity, and mobilization skills have revived the anti-pornography movement. As Executive Director of National Center on Sexual Exploitation, Mrs. Hawkins has developed a national strategy uniting conservative women's rights, child advocacy, and religious groups, including bipartisan political leadership, to work towards raising awareness of the pandemic of harm from pornography. Her initiatives have led to sweeping policy changes for targets such as Google, Verizon, and the Department of Defense. She is a graduate of Tufts University and currently resides with her husband and 2 children in Virginia. And lastly, I'd just like to thank our sponsors, the Gender Relations Center, the Institute for Church Life, the Center for Ethics and Culture, and the Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and Public Life. And now please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good evening. I'm going to go ahead and get started by showing you all a little bit of pornography. You guys ready? Here you go. Do you remember the dress from a year ago? The one that broke the internet? This was a dress that was photographed and it was sent via text from a woman to one of her friends. And she said, what do you think of this dress? I think it was for a wedding. And she said, I thought our colors were black and blue. Why did you send me the picture? Why are we going with white and gold? And what we discovered is that a number of people would look at the same dress on this picture, and they would see white and gold, and a good number of people would see it as black and blue. And actually, there was actually a third group that would see it as, I think, brown and blue as well. Now, this is an animated GIF, or GIF, depending on how you pronounce it, that kind of shows when you alter the white contrast, you can actually see it as white and gold, but then you see it as blue and black. Now, for brain scientists, we look at this and we say, oh yeah, we totally get this. This is exactly what we do, is we look at how when you look at something, does context influence the way that you see it? And so we think about the dress there sort of in the upper right-hand corner again, this notion that things that have colors should remain constant, right? That my jacket just doesn't randomly change its color, that it's always the same color, even though in moonlight we perceive it as subtly different than we see it at noonday. So there's these issues of color constancy. Also, we have this as an image. This is not actually the dress in real life, is it? This is an image that had been taken with a phone camera and sent via text. We don't know if there's a person wearing this dress. We don't know if it's hanging from a hanger. We don't know if it's on a mannequin, because the boundaries limit our ability to see the bigger picture. And so boundaries can limit the way that you see colors. You may not be aware of that. In the same way, we know that when you alter the white balance and you bring more wavelengths of light into it, you can change the way that we perceive it. This is a picture, right? This is a digitized, pixelated version of a real dress. This is not the real dress. And the larger context is interesting, because even people who are seeing the same picture, my wife and I were looking at the picture on my phone, and I saw it as yellow and gold, and she saw it as black and blue. Well, your own personal history, your own personal experience, your own neurological development can influence whether you will see it as black and blue or white and gold. We see there are gender differences and that there are different percentages between males who will see it as black and blue versus females who will see it as black and blue. We see developmentally that the older you are, you will tend to see it one way versus a younger person who would see it subtly in a different way. So this notion that even under the same conditions, people can see the same thing but come to very different conclusions about it is a well understood neurobiological reality. So if we stop and we think about this as maybe a metaphor for an entire generation of young people who have grown up on internet pornography informing the way they think about sexuality, is it any wonder how attitudes about sexuality in our culture among those aged 15 to 35 are very, very different than attitudes about sexuality for those who are 55 to 75. Because one generation looks at this and says, sexuality is about black and blue. And another generation says, no, sexuality is about white and gold. And we have this sort of generation gap difference between how those two generations understand sexuality. And so what I want to argue is that perhaps pornography contributes to the way that we think about the constancy of sexuality. That sexuality is sort of a recreational commodity. It's something that we do kind of for fun, as opposed to having a different type of narrative associated with it. That pornography inherently does have boundaries that are very, very different from sex in the way that older people understood sex, right? The boundaries of the pixels on the monitor. This notion of balance and production and the way that pornography is produced. It's pixelated. It's distributed in a very different way. If I wanted to get access to pornographic material when I was a young man, I had to go to a store and buy a magazine. There was a ritual that was associated with it. Whereas now the ritual is close the door in my dorm room and click the mouse and I'm there. And I have access to much more material through the internet than I ever would have through maybe the 9 or 10 pages in the magazine that would actually contain nudity in them. It would be a very stable, static picture as opposed to something that is actually interactive. You can search and do searches for specific tags or items on pornography to find the thing that you're just looking for. So the notion of the pornographic narrative is very, very different for your generation, which is different from mine, and frankly, even older generations. And so we're seeing now a movement towards people talking about pornography as something that you can become addicted to. Right? That perhaps a person who is viewing pornographic material is somehow sexually depraved, they're degenerate, that there's something morally wrong with them, and so they're kind of like a drug addict would be. And so when we use this language of addiction, we need to be very careful about that, because when we talk about drugs will have specific uses, right? Antibiotics, they're used to kind of help fight bacterial infections. But if I take an antibiotic to try to, increase my physique, to make me look more handsome, right, or to get rid of my body fat, my abdominal fat is excessively stubborn, I can't get rid of it. So I'm going to take some antibiotics to get rid of my stomach fat. That's actually not going to happen, because that's not what antibiotics do. What I'm doing is I'm misusing the drug for a purpose that it is not designed for. Does that make sense? I could also kind of move away from maybe 1 or 2 times taking the antibiotic to taking, it several times a day for the next 3 months. More than likely, I'm going to start doing damage to my immune system because I do that. I'm going to compromise my body, my liver, my kidneys, right? Maybe even other systems in my body will not like having this antibiotic around, and it will start to do damage now. And this would distinguish, for example, the misuse of a drug as now abuse of a drug, where you're taking a drug and it's doing damage to the system. It's abusing the system. But if we think about, let's take another drug, alcohol, right? You can use alcohol to calm you down. You can use alcohol to make your red meat taste better. You can use alcohol as part of communion. And we'd say all of those are appropriate uses of alcohol. But I could misuse alcohol because I drink too much to avoid having conversations with my wife. Right? So I just don't want to deal with the stress in my life, so I'm just going to knock back a bunch of beers, and that's going to sedate me, right? So now that's not really solving my problem, is it? Because when I wake up after my, passing out and I'm hungover, my wife is still there and the problems are still existing, right? So I'm misusing alcohol to try to treat a problem that it doesn't really treat. Or I could be, a student at a prestigious undergraduate university or research university like Notre Dame, and it's getting towards the end of the semester, guys, and it's getting stressful. And so you get to Friday night and you just go and just party, because the alcohol in the party is a way of kind of helping you resolve your stress. Actually, resolving your stress probably would be better suited by doing your projects on time and writing your papers on time, right? But all that stress that's built up, that you still have stuff to do, you get drunk, you party, you pass out, you wake up, the problems are still there. But if you drink too much, you get alcohol poisoning, right? And so you end up at the hospital. That would be the abuse of alcohol. Now, none of those circumstances, whether it be drinking for pleasure, drinking to avoid conversations with my wife, or drinking because I'm just blowing off some steam and maybe drank too much, and got my stomach pumped, would constitute being an alcoholic, right? An alcohol addict. Because addiction is marked by a number of things, dependency and tolerance. And what we find is that this addiction language is kind of backwards. Because any drug that you can become addicted to, people don't become addicted to aspirin. They don't become addicted to antibiotics, do they? They become addicted to drugs that specifically activate the brain's natural hedonic system. And so cocaine, amphetamine, all of these drugs are working on what's already there. Well, what's already there is food when you're hungry, tastes good. Water when you're thirsty, tastes good. Sexual intimacy feels good. See, we're designed, we're built for sexual intimacy and pleasure. We're not made for heroin. But heroin produces addiction in a very sinister way because it gets in and activates these circuits in a unique way. So when we talk about pornography addiction, we've kind of actually got it backwards. Heroin is actually injected orgasm. When we talk to heroin users, they'll actually talk about like a sexual high that they get off of it. So using the porn addiction language actually sort of has the script backwards. We're made for sexuality. But pornography is a disembodied form of usually arousing you to a place where you'll masturbate and kind of feel the sexual high of orgasm in the absence of another person. Sometimes it can be, part of the sequence of sexual intimacy. But more often than not, pornography is used as a way to generate arousal, and then people will sexually act out. And what happens is over time we're seeing more and more that people are oriented towards porn as opposed to oriented towards people. So they're not heterosexual, they're actually more pornosexual. And so they think about other people as being able to fit into their script. It's sort of, they see people as sort of white and gold as opposed to blue and black. And so this language of pornosexual is one that I'm seeing people use more and more, but also thinking about, well, why would you use porn? Well, you use it to kind of self-medicate, to manage the traumas that you've had. You just like with drinking alcohol, use it to manage stress. Many men will report, look, I'm just stressed out, all I want to do is go to sleep. And I know that if I go online and I view this material and it helps me, as I masturbate, that'll put me to sleep. And I feel better, I feel like the stress is gone. Or it's a way that they deal with anxiety. And yes, there's an erotic sensuality component to it, but many men will view it because they're just impulsive. Hey, did you hear about this particular celebrity? I wonder if there's any naked pictures of them online. And they'll type it up and they'll see. Or to work out frustration or anger, and this we need to be very careful, can be tied to misogyny and sort of a hatred of women especially. And so we do see, for example, I work with some of the local diagnostic centers, and it's very, very common to see sex offenders actually using pornography as part of their the way of their sort of working through their own sexuality. So if we think about these issues related to, the availability of porn, you guys know it's all over the place. It's on your phones now. It's on your computers that you don't even need to be connected through a hard line to. You can get it through Wi-Fi, you can get it through Snapchat, you can get it through any number of ways. And so we think about how does pornography confuse us in the way that we understand nudity and nakedness. Most people see those terms as sort of synonymous with one another. Right? Nudity is being in a condition of disrobedness, right? You don't have any clothes on. It doesn't mean that you're naked. Naked actually is being in a place of vulnerability. When we think about sexual nakedness, it is being disrobed, but it is also being vulnerable. But you can be vulnerable with clothes on, can't you? In your sexuality. So if we think about this issue of nakedness and even the language of pornography, well, what does it mean? How much clothes do you need to have on? Is it people having sex? There's a lot of discussion in scientific communities and philosophical communities, theological communities, about, well, what is going on here? And so I've actually started to move away from the use of pornography as a term because it confuses people. And I like just talking about sexually explicit imagery. Because you can have sexually explicit imagery in a medical textbook, can't you? It's just naked people, these are the parts, this is what we name this part, this is what we name that part. It is sexually explicit, but it's not explicit in such a way to be designed to elicit arousal. Pornography inherently is designed to elicit arousal. Medical textbooks are not designed to titillate. That's not what they're there for. However, a person who is in a very bad place mentally can become titillated by something that wasn't designed to excite them. And so if we think about sexually explicit imagery or even sexually solicitous imagery, I wandered off to, there's the mall, right? There's the big mall, sort of down 23 or whatever. And I just kind of was killing some time and I was walking through the mall. And you know, you can actually have non-sexually explicit imagery, but it be solicitous. Walk by Victoria's Secret. That's solicitous. That's lots of women with stuff covered, but they're bending and their skin exposed, right? And there's these sort of come hither looks, right? There's all of this stuff that's solicitous, inviting you into perhaps something that could develop into a sexual encounter. And so we see this language of the objectification of women. I don't like that language. I think that we don't objectify women because in these solicitous images and pornography and all these sexually explicit things that we see online, men and even women who look at them generally don't see them as non-human. They see them as human, but their morality is sort of stripped away and they're actually just wanton animals. See, pornography doesn't objectify people, it dehumanizes them. It animalizes them. They're just wanton animals that just are waiting to have sex without even really asking for it. They're just there expecting it. And so this plays out in the kinds of scripts that we see in young people, in junior hires, thinking about, well, you know, what happens in a sexually intimate encounter? If you're raised on porn, it means that two people probably have minimal conversation. They maybe kiss a couple of times. They disrobe if they're not already disrobed. And then act X occurs, then act Y occurs, then act Z occurs, and then the script is concluded. And in most pornography, that usually means the man ejaculates. And okay, that's what a sexual encounter entails. And so when you're raised in a culture that sees this as the script, it causes you to see sexual intimacy as white and gold dress, as opposed to something that could be very, very different. Now, this can also be played out, I would argue, in erotica. So you know, many times men get picked on because they look at porn. Well, women read romance novels, and those romance novels can equally influence expectations. Think the 50 Shades of Grey, right? There's these notions that they get not through the visual stimulation, but actually through the narrative of the encounter being played out in the mind. And I do think that what it does is it warps our scripts and causes us to think about sexuality as sort of this payoff at the end that usually is tied up in the person's orgasmic sort of experience, and maybe connection with their partner, maybe not. Generally speaking, it rarely includes any discussion of consequences, perhaps of conception of a child. But we think about this kind of erotic script as also potentially damaging as well. 50 Shades of Grey in that whole erotica genre is sometimes referred to as mommy porn because of the way that women are drawn to that. The only reason why the e-Kindle kind of works for Amazon is because of the women who are buying romance novels. That is what's driving and keeping that platform alive, is women buying romance novels, 99-cent romance novels, as series over and over again. It's not because of the textbooks. It's not because of the Harry Potter books. It's because of these romance novels that keep these things afloat. And so what I'd like to kind of offer, before I go forward a little bit further, is that perhaps what pornography is doing is it is changing our scripts, getting us to see sex through a particular lens, and we are neurologically groomed to actually embrace what is in reality a form of sexual exploitation. That pornography is probably a subset of sexual exploitation, and it can actually get even a deeper hook into us if we use the cultural language of empowerment. That pornography is empowering the people in the videos, and it's empowering you as you're consuming it. When in reality, it's about as empowering as a Snickers bar is. Snickers bars is processed sugar, and it actually makes you unhealthy. But if you think you're feeding yourself, you're going to eat a lot of those things, and you're going to get more and more unhealthy. But you're exploiting the sweetness of the processed chocolate and the ease with which it gets through the digestive system, so that you're consuming it thinking that you're being fed and nourished, when in truth you're actually becoming more and more unhealthy. Now, a couple things with respect to what does this sexual exploitation look like. We know that there is a disproportionate effect on the production side. Women are going to be more exploited than men are. There's more women who are used and discarded in the pornography and the adult sex industry. There are men as well who are exploited too. Not that it's just gay porn either, but in straight porn, the men who are used are not even identified oftentimes. The clips are just of the woman that's in there. It's not even the man. He's a prop for all intents and purposes. He's not even a human to be seen as a wanton sexual animal. Whereas on the consumption side, that men are going to be the ones who are viewing the majority of the pornography. Women are as well, but to a lesser extent. When we look at the production side, research looking at mental health issues of female adult film performers, when compared to sort of a state sample of women in California, boy, there's a lot of things that we see as predictors for whether or not you go into the adult film industry. And none of them are good. Broken home, neglect, abandonment, sexual abuse, prostitution, early sexual experiences. And when we look at the outcomes, the majority of them are not very good. We overestimate how much money these women are in fact getting paid, when the reality is that they come out of it with significantly more trauma. If they didn't have substance abuse going in, now they've got it. There are issues related to depression and bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety, PTSD. They leave their previous social networks. They adopt the sex industry as their social network, which generally speaking cannot help them near as well. We see that there is a number of general health issues with financial insecurity. They're not making a lot of money. They're not making near as much as we think they are. And while they may make a lot of money up front, so they'll get paid a good portion of money to do a particular sex act, after they do it, they get paid less for that. In most industries, the more you do something, the better you get at it, the more you get paid for it. They will engage in surgical repair of their body or bodily enhancement. Think about the kind of physical trauma that they go through. It's easy to show that this is a bad thing for women. It's easy to show that it's a bad thing for men. If you look at Time magazine from last week, there's an entire generation of men, once again, that 18 to 35 cluster, that's realizing that they are pornosexual, that they have difficulty even achieving an erection when they're with a real naked woman. Because as Virginia Woolf would say, real naked women are just bad porn. And so we have an entire generation of young men that are realizing that watching this stuff has changed them, so that they just, as David Rothbard would say, not be into anyone, because they'd much rather go back to the screen, because screens aren't complicated. The women on the screen are always available. They don't come with any strings that are attached. And so men's ability to pour time into women, to cultivate relationships, well, is being markedly impaired. We know there's broad agreement in the community that sexually explicit material, pornography, influence the way we have expectations about sexual encounters, the demands that we would expect to get out of them. They're going to be linked to risky sexual behaviors, decreasing age of first intercourse. It can be counteracted, however, by being trained in what the bad consequences are. But the old studies show that no, the aggression stuff, there's kind of, there's inconsistency there. But the newer data actually suggests that no, this is actually linked to aggressive behavior. This is actually linked to sexual aggression. And so I think what we have is now an era where we have sex as a recreational commodity. And there's this host of things that we see can influence the way a person thinks about sex or porn as applicable in real life. You become more distracted by sex, you're more permissive of things. And some people were even beginning to make the argument that it is now causing many men to be blind to nonverbal, non-consent cues. That yes means yes. Well, what happens if you don't say anything? That doesn't mean that it still is yes. And so their ability to pick up on facial grimaces that would show discomfort or displeasure, they don't even register with some of these. Even the thought of an entire genre of porn, of having sex with someone who is unconscious. How can you give consent when you're unconscious? Men are much more willing to sort of embrace that as, oh, that's just kind of fun. So we have this pornographic script. We see there's a lot of bad stuff. And by the way, guys, it also makes you feel small in a genital sense. When we look at men sort of overestimating the size of the average penis and their own genital self-esteem. Men feel like, boy, I wish I could be bigger. So it's not just bad thinking about women, it's also bad thinking about men. So this kind of notion of porn addiction, perhaps porn is a supranormal stimulus. It's a type of stimulus that you could never get in real life. If we were to fill this room up with naked people, right, it would be weird, number one. It would, because, you might bump into someone and skin-on-skin contact kind of feels weird, right? We can only get so many naked people in this room. But you can see tens of thousands of naked people in 20 minutes in the privacy of your own dormitory. You can't see that. You can't do that in real life. And so porn sort of acts on us neurologically in a way that the real world doesn't. We're seeing more organizations like Fight the New Drug, Guilty Pleasure, Porn Harms, popping up, really kind of pushing back. But my area is looking at the brain science. What happens when you look at the brains of people who are viewing pornography? What happens when you compare men here on the left to women on the right? This is a study back from 2004. Once again, this is people who are probably college-age students in 2004, which means now they're probably in their early 30s. Right? And so what we see is these significant gender differences in deep brain systems that are involved in hedonic pleasure. So thinking about here in the upper left, in men, you get deep brain mesolimbic activation, that system that's involved in drugs of addiction. But remember, this is what it's made for, so it's not surprising that you see activity here. These regions to the left as well. The amygdaloid activity, that's the sexual arousal, that's the sexual tension center that is, it becomes activated. And that in the presence of orgasm is now released. And you feel that great relief from the sexual energy, the sexual tension. You see things going on here in the occipital lobe, in the back of the brain in men. It's really activating now. Well, when compared to women, they're activated nowhere near as much as men with the energy and the tension, but these women would probably report it makes them uncomfortable, makes them think that it's dirty, it's disgusting, it's not exciting. So they interpret that arousal in a very different way. We are moving into an era now where we're looking at your generation, and there is some evidence to suggest, at least what we're doing in our lab, that women have actually been groomed to adopt this male pattern now. Because your generation of young ladies are growing up thinking that sex is like, why can't we have the same kind of sexual patterns that men do? Which to me sort of sees the male pattern as the default, as the preferred pattern, which I think we need to have a conversation about. But we are seeing more and more women now reporting porn addiction, sexual compulsivity problems. And we are seeing that they tend to have a pattern of activity that looks very much like men. We know there's a lot of other neurological data, looking at mirror neuron systems here, looking at what happens when people view these images and how does that stimulate erection in men. Do they report sort of feeling mapped on to people? We look at the correlates of compulsive sexual behaviors, looking at does this change the size of brain regions, or is it correlated with the size of different brain regions? Specifically the right putamen, looking at orbitofrontal connections to these deeper brain centers to regulate emotions. We're seeing that, yeah, perhaps there's some links here. So is it that the porn viewing is causing these neurological problems, or do these neurological problems find themselves present in people who are prone to viewing too much pornography? As well, you know, which is a chicken or the egg kind of problem. I don't care. We've got chickens that are reproducing. So either vulnerable people are being exploited, or the viewing of this material is causing damage neurologically. Is it reversible? That's what we're trying to figure out. As a scientist, I can't say yes, I can't say no, but I'm saying, well, I think much of the speculation is that it can, but we need to have our theory in place before we can actually go testing it. So thinking about this, I would say, you know, if you want to come at it from a theological perspective, certainly from a Catholic perspective, Catholics have a great theology of the body, a great theology of sexuality. Protestants, not so much. But thinking about the pornified culture, about sex as a commodity, as something that, you know, boy, goodness, we're beginning to see all of these taboos being stripped away. Taboos just of voyeurism. I mean, what is pornography if not being a digital peeping Tom? That's what it is. So we strip away the voyeurism taboo. What's the next taboo that we strip away? Well, promiscuity. Then, well, we can strip away any number of things. You know, sex in public. We can strip away sex with people of the same sex. We can strip away, oh goodness, the age of consent as well. Teen is one of the most searched items. And there's only 2 legal teens, 18 and 19. And there's a lot of other teens that are not legal. Incest is also another taboo that's being stripped away. Incest genres, you know, father and stepdaughter, you know, stepson and mother, right? That's another taboo that's being stripped away. And so we think about the use of pornography, its role is to normalize things that are taboo. Because the more you see something, the more willing you are to embrace it as a norm. And so maybe our perception is misleading. And so I think a poor understanding of sort of theology can lead us to a place where we have a hermeneutic of legalism. We think about sexuality as just a bunch of rules that you have to follow. Or it can go to the exact opposite side and say anything goes as long as you have consenting adults. Now, we know that the dress in real life is in fact blue and black. I don't see the blue and black dress. I actually see the yellow and the gold dress when I look at that image. And so I'm actually wrong. But I'm wrong in a number of ways as well. I'm also red colorblind. I have protanopia. So I don't see reds. I don't see oranges or pinks or purples. I don't see those things. Don't ask me what that thing is. I'm going to know it's probably red. Because people say, what does that look like? What does that look like? Well, it's probably red. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking me that. But I'll tell you what, when I come to the stoplight and I see the top light is lit, even though I don't perceive what you perceive, I stop. See, we can alter and modify our behaviors to be in accordance with the reality that is beyond what we can perceive. And so for some people, they may not see that, but that doesn't mean that they can't change their behaviors. And perhaps, maybe they can start seeing the red. They can start moving from seeing the dress as white and gold to blue and black, which is what it actually is. Now, I want to make sure I save some time for Mrs. Hawkins here. So I will stop and we'll have some time for questions at the end, I'm assuming, but I'm going to turn it over to John at this point.
Okay, hello. You're all so high. All right, so I'm from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. We're based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for 54 years, mostly combating the harms of pornography, kind of on a policy legal side, but we also talk a lot about exposing the connections between all forms of sexual exploitation. We see that sexual violence, prostitution, pornography, sex trafficking, all of these things are really linked together. And so our goal as an organization is to help our policymakers, educators, and others, people of influence, to see these connections as well. But mostly I'm going to talk really about the role pornography plays in all of these things. We already talked kind of about what pornography is. I'm going to go a little bit further and talk about what mainstream pornography is today. One of the best ways I know to explain it without going into too much graphic detail is this study by Dr. Anna Bridges, where she observed 50 of the top selling porn titles, and they found that 88% of them showed physical aggression, and 94% of that aggression was aggression against women. So when we're talking about pornography today, mainstream pornography, hardcore pornography is incredibly violent and degrading and mostly targeting women. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about pictures of, topless women when I'm talking about pornography in 2016. Also, this is from a very popular website that puts out all their statistics each year, how much pornography was watched the year before. You can see that there were 300 million hours of pornography watched just last year. Can you believe that? That's just one pornography site. One. And teen was the #1 search term. Teen has been the #1 search term for the last 2 years on this very popular website. And among the other top 10 terms, 3 of the other terms in the top 10 were teen themed as well, like babysitter or something else. The top gaming searches for young people for age 18 to 24 were these. You can see what people are looking at. There's a survey that was just released actually last week through the Barna Institute. It's called the Porn Phenomenon, right? And one thing that just blew my mind in this study was when they asked young people who are ages 18 to 25 about the morality of viewing pornography. They asked them a series of different questions. 47% said that it was not immoral to be watching pornography that depicted girls who looked like they were forced or that they were being abused. 47% of young people aged 18 to 25 said that wasn't immoral, even though it looked like the girls were being forced. That's crazy, isn't it? That's where we are right now when I'm talking about hardcore pornography. Now, we want to shift the language on the discussion of pornography from that of just a moral argument. It is incredibly damaging to us spiritually. That is a reality. But we also know that it's causing a public health crisis in our society. We just talked a little bit about how it impacts the brain. We know that men, women too, and children are developing dependencies and addictions that are affecting them for years. Often it's for their entire lifetime. It becomes a struggle. We know that it impacts the physical, psychological, and emotional development of children. It affects how they're able to view themselves, their value in society, but also it impacts how they view those of the opposite sex. It impacts what they think is expected of them, the trust that they have for one another, their self-confidence, their esteem. All of those things come into play when our children are being exposed to this at a young age. We know that it destroys families. It's linked very much with anxiety and depression, guilt and shame, and all those feelings kind of create this toxic environment that really allows for the addiction to just strengthen and stew. It normalizes sexual violence, deters marriage, exploits women and children, and we see that it is a major factor contributing to the demand for child sexual abuse images or child pornography and for prostituted and trafficked women and children. To understand how it's really linked to those last things I said, it's important to really understand the brain science, which we just went over some. But one of the things that I am just fascinated with that we kind of left out because you only had 20 minutes, I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. But when we're getting ready to engage in an intimate relationship with our partner, our husbands, our wives, our brains emit certain chemicals. These chemicals help us to feel really excited for what's about to happen. That's really wonderful when it's with our husband or with our wife. It helps you focus on the good things about your spouse. It helps you focus on the things you find attractive. It helps you get excited for what's going to happen. It increases feelings of trust, those kinds of things. With pornography, a lot of those chemicals are also released in great abundance when viewing pornography. But instead of then focusing on and bonding with another human being, you're just focused on the genitals, on the sex act itself, no emotion tied in, no other intimacy. You're instead bonding with pixels. You can see how that disrupts your relationship with another human being, right? Now, after you engage in intimate relations with your spouse, with your partner, other chemicals are released, and those chemicals really help you to feel satisfied. They help you to cement that as a positive memory, and just increases that feeling of trust and bond with that other person. Fantastic with your husband or your wife. Terrible with pornography, because when you're viewing pornography, actually, very little of those chemicals are released after you have reached orgasm watching pornography. So instead of getting that feeling of satisfaction, you get just this momentary feeling of satisfaction, but then you're craving that adrenaline and that dopamine rush once again. And so you can see now why it's possible for people who are hooked on pornography to want to watch it for hours and hours and not even really realize that time has passed, or that it's affecting the rest of their life. You can see also why people get bored with the same kinds of materials. Playboy doesn't even have pornography anymore. Now, they got rid of it just the last month. This isn't a good thing. It's not because they all of a sudden got, some kind of moral code. No, it's because people don't care anymore about the type of images that were in Playboy. We've digressed so much from those kind of topless images of women to this hardcore pornography that nobody wanted to buy that stuff anymore, right? This is because our brains have changed over time. Now, the beautiful thing is our brains are plastic. I always show this picture because it just gives me so much hope, but our bodies are programmed to have this incredible, strong, long-lasting bond with another human being. This is my friend's great-grandparents on their 83rd wedding anniversary. He was 104 and she was 101. Isn't it beautiful? That's what we're meant to have. Our brains are meant to grow and change together over time, but pornography completely disrupts the ability to really do that. But just like our brains change over time here, it is possible to change back. So it's not hopeless if you're struggling with pornography or if your brain has started to change these ways. There are ways. It's hard work, but there are ways to overcome it. I want to spend a couple minutes talking specifically about how pornography affects family and relationships. That's what I was really asked to kind of hone in on. One of the best studies, I think, or papers out there is this one by Dr. Jill Manning, where she did a meta-analysis of many studies. It's kind of old, though. She did it in 2006. But since she did this study, there are dozens of other studies that have come out showing essentially the same points as hers. So I can help you guys find those if you're looking for more updated studies, but they're really showing the same things. We see that people who are viewing pornography have decreased sensitivity toward women, and this isn't only men who are viewing pornography, but also women who are viewing pornography. It has the same kind of impact. We see less progressive views of gender roles, increased risk of becoming aggressive and abusive. This one blows my mind, but people who are regularly viewing pornography are 3 times more likely to commit adultery and 4 times more likely to act out with a prostituted woman. And this statistic has come out in a couple of different studies. I'm not saying that everyone who views pornography will act out with somebody else, but you are much more likely to when viewing pornography. We also know that you become regular viewers of pornography acquire a mechanical view of sexuality. Imagine how that affects your marriage and your relationship when you've stripped away all the feelings and the intimacy that goes along with this kind of behavior. It draws a wedge right between your relationship. We see that there's increased risk of sexual dysfunction and dissatisfaction. Since I'm talking to college students, I will tell you, just in 2013, there were 3 studies that came out at the end of the year, really close to each other. One was in the US, Italy, and Norway. And these 3 studies all found that there's increased occurrences of porn-induced sexual dysfunction or erectile dysfunction in young men who are just in their 20s and 30s. That's when you're supposed to be at your height sexually, our young men are supposed to be. But instead they're struggling with erectile dysfunction because they've been using and masturbating to pornography since they were just adolescents. That has a terrible cost to relationships and to marriages. Just at the end of 2014, another study came out showing number 8 again, that those who are viewing pornography tend to have a decreased desire to marry and have children. The study that came out in 2014 was analyzing a lot of reasons why young men might not want to be married. And it was like 60-something%, sorry I don't remember exactly, said that it was, that pornography was an outlet to why they didn't feel like they needed to get married. They don't have to have a relationship with another human being because they feel like their sexual needs are being met through pornography. And then, as I already said, there's definitely a diminished spirituality and respect for sacred aspects of life. And no matter your religious affiliation, when your spiritual life has just been totally broken, your ability to bond with another human being, with your spouse and your children, is greatly affected. And pornography, you have to think about the role that plays there as well. So I'm not a super expert on cognitive scripts theory, maybe you are, Dr. Schrothers, but I just found, I've been reading about this a lot lately and I find it very fascinating. But really what it teaches us is that all media, it's not just pornography that I'm talking about, but kind of all media provides a heuristic model for learning, and it's really an incredible way to learn. It helps you understand what should or should not be happening, how people should or should not behave, in what is happening, and what the outcomes of a particular course of action should be. And we learn, it's the perfect way to learn something when, just think about all the violence we're seeing in video games. There's so many studies showing how young children are acting out more violent tendencies on one another because they're bombarded with these violent images all the time. Well, it's the same kind of thing with when you're being bombarded with sexual images all the time. This study that just came out last year showed that the porn users used pornography scripts to navigate real-world sexual experiences. This is how they made sense of the experiences they were having with people of the opposite gender. And that it wasn't just a fantasy, but it was their template for how sexual behavior should be. They also found that they were more likely to recall those images that they saw in pornography when actually engaging in a sexual act with another human being. Instead of being really there present, they were really focused on the things that they were watching in pornography. Also, they tend to request particular pornographic sex acts of their partner, which that also shows us why there's increased prostitution and trafficking, because oftentimes the wives and girlfriends don't want to do what the girls in pornography are doing. And the men often know that, so they seek to act it out elsewhere, often without even talking to their wives or girlfriends about this kind of fantasy that they have. We know also that it's negatively associated with enjoying sexually intimate behaviors with a partner. They'd rather be using the computer instead. Here's a good quote, I think, that I just want to read for you. Sexual fantasy is rehearsal for relationships. If you image others as mere instruments for your gratification, you're literally rehearsing exploitative patterns of behavior towards others. The more you picture yourself either using others or being used, the more such encounters will feel familiar and normal. And the cognitive script theory and the study from 2014 back that up even more. I'm going to just skip that one. But so what do we want in our relationships, right? Do we want the healthy and stable marriage where there's a mutual belief in marriage, where there's fidelity, where you're able to trust one another, there's mutual respect, there's safety, all of these things? Or do we want what I was just explaining are the common effects of people who are regularly using pornography, right? I mean, I think it's obvious. We hope for the one on the left. I think we already talked a little bit more about how pornography harms kids, but I just want to build out a little bit more about some of the consequences. What does that mean for our children who are being exposed to pornography? We're seeing early sexual debut with multiple partners. A study that came out of the UK 2 years ago found that 3 out of 5 15-year-old girls were already engaging in group sex. That's crazy. No studies like that have been done in the US, but I believe I'm sure it's not so totally different than in the UK. We're seeing that kids tend to think that sex and intimacy equals porn sex. They think that what they've viewed in pornography, the violence, the degradation, those kinds of things are normal, and that's what they're supposed to be engaging in. We see increased child-on-child sexual abuse. It's not so much that children are trying to hurt one another, but their curiosity, they tend to act out on each other more often. And also, we've totally normalized this behavior. Children have learned that this is what adults do, and it's okay, because adults must like it, right? So children are acting out on it. I mean, I hear tons of stories. I have Google alerts turned on, and I get a list of news articles from around the country every day, and just the amount of children acting out on each other is crazy. Sexting. Now we have children who are producers and distributors of child pornography. And it's become so normalized. So many young girls think that they have to do this. A girl in my church, she was, this just happened a week ago. I work with the young girls in my church, and she called me. It turns out that she had sent images of herself to a young man who, well, we think he was a young man, who was probably not a young man, but who kind of talked her into sending these images, and then he sent it to all of her family, all of her friends, everything, because she wouldn't act out, she wouldn't meet him. And so he used those images against her. And we're seeing, there was a study that came out last year together with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and another institute with a super long name, I forget, but they found that 2/3 of sex that are produced by children are ending up on third-party websites. 2/3. So one problem we're seeing is that a lot of times young people think that if they're sending these kinds of images, it's only going to the person they send it to, only to their boyfriend, only to their girlfriend. But what we're seeing is that they're being shared again and again. These things are often hacked. I mean, there was like the Snapchat gate or whatever they were calling it, where all those images were hacked. And so we have to recognize that these images are not just staying with who you think they're staying with. Let me just say, Dr. Struthers talked a little bit about those who are in pornography, but Jenna Jameson is a really famous porn performer. But this is her story, her background. She was raped when she was 15. She was raped a second time when she was 16. Then she was gang raped, beaten, left for dead, again at 16. She ran away. To make money, she became a stripper. And then now she's a porn star. This is her background, and this is the background of so many who are in this industry. So we have to stop just accepting the argument that it's consensual and that these people, whatever people do, it's their own right and choice. No, we have to stand up and we have to protect the dignity of everyone, even when they don't realize that it's their dignity that they're giving away. We would argue that if we want to do something to curb the problem of all these problems up above, addiction, divorce, sex trafficking, prostitution, we have to do something to curb one of the main factors leading to these things. And we would argue hardcore adult pornography is one of those factors. Now, many people don't realize that it's actually against the law, against federal law, to distribute hardcore pornography on the internet. Did you guys know that? No, like almost no one knows that. It's against federal law to distribute hardcore pornography on the internet, cable, satellite TV, and hotels, motels, and retail shops, and even through the mail. But it's in all of these places because the U.S. Department of Justice doesn't enforce these laws right now. So that's one of the things we work on, trying to get these laws enforced. But when these laws were enforced under Reagan and Bush 1, very vigorously enforced, what happened, first of all, they won every case, which is amazing. And secondly, the worst types of pornography at the time, which were child-themed and rape-themed pornography, they pretty much were wiped out. The pornographers started self-regulating. They stopped making those really deviant types of pornography. So the law is a powerful teacher, but it also shows us that if we can curb hardcore pornography, we can curb some of these other social ills at the top of the pyramid. Now, time is going fast and I think everyone is sleepy. I just want to end and say that it's beyond an individual or a family's capacity to protect against this alone. I hear that argument all the time. Just protect your kids. Well, now I have 2 kids and it's impossible because everywhere I go, my son is seeing these images. It takes us as families and individuals stepping up and doing something, but it also takes universities and medical professionals and law enforcement and government officials and researchers and all of us to come together and try to find a solution to this public health crisis. We want to fight for this. We want to fight for love and for family and for that deep joy that we were built to have. There's so much we can do. Let me skip forward. Just because this is our little expertise, I'm going to tell you about the Dirty Dozen list. There's a list up there if you want, but each year we come up with 12 targets who we see as major facilitators of sexual exploitation in America, and most of them are involved somehow with pornography. So we list these 12. I thought it was kind of a dumb idea when we started 4 years ago, but we've had incredible success as a result. Google got rid of sexual explicit images in Google Play, and no more pornographic ads allowed on Google. We got the Air Force and the Army to stop selling pornography. Verizon got rid of child-themed and trafficking-themed porn titles that they had. We've just had, most recently we've got 4 major hotel chains to get rid of pornography completely. Intercontinental Hotel Group, Starwood, Hilton, and Hyatt all have just changed their policies in the last year to no longer allow pornography. So by the end of 2016, it'll be gone. So what I want to say, though, is if we stand up and we say that it's not okay in our society to facilitate, to normalize this type of things, we can really make a significant difference, and it will help protect children and families where it's beyond their control as individuals to do it. I want to just give you my contact information if you want. We have internships if anyone wants to come to DC. We do a lot on Capitol Hill. We have a law center for anyone interested in that kind of thing. We work on trafficking and prostitution issues as well. So I think now Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. Round of applause. So we have probably about 10 minutes for question and answer. If anyone has anything, please stand up. Just introduce yourself briefly, name and year, and your panelists are here. Thank you.
I think some people tend to ask, because I'm guessing you're all kind of dating, right? Do you have questions about dating? Yeah? Okay, well, let me say something. I think a lot of times younger people ask me, well, what about dating? Like, how do we navigate that world? Because the reality is that almost everyone's been exposed to this stuff, right? So it's not like you're really going to find someone who's never seen pornography. A lot of young girls think that that will be possible. But in today's world, it's not really. What I like to tell people is, I'm not a super expert on this, but you want to talk about this stuff regularly and early before a relationship progresses. And it's hard to start the conversation. When I was dating my husband, we went canoeing, and he was stuck out with me on the canoe. So it was the perfect opportunity to not let him get away. But you want to talk about this stuff. And then if they are using pornography or are struggling with it maybe, you want to have clear boundaries on what is okay to you, and you want to stick to those. So maybe it's you don't want to let the relationship progress too much farther unless they stop using it or unless they get help for it. And then I want to say too, like progressing to marriage. A lot of people think, I think also especially a lot of religious young people think that if they're struggling with pornography that when they get married, it will just be fixed. And that's not true. What we're finding is that often people who are struggling with pornography even after being married, that struggle intensifies. And there's a lot of reasons we could talk about there, but my advice to you is to not allow a relationship to progress to that point unless someone has really gotten help and they've been clean from it for I'd say a year, but you probably have a lot more to add. To our imaginary question that didn't come.
Well, in lieu of you asking us questions, how about I'll ask you all a question? What of the things you heard tonight, what are maybe one or two of the things that were most surprising to you? Anyone want to jump on that?
I think I was most surprised by, I guess, the violence associated with it, and like how much that is going to change people's things.
Any others? This is the professor in me coming out. Other things maybe that surprised you?
I think just like the number of hours that I would log on like that one porn site, which is incredible.
Yeah, and it's interesting because most of these sites do not actually pay for their own content. What they do is they actually draw their income from the ads that are on the side. So even if you would want to say, well, I'm viewing something that is consensual, that somebody made, it's a product that I'm consuming, and I'm not paying for it. Well, actually, you kind of are creating, or you're a part of the demand that enables these websites to stay up. Because as you go and you're sort of watching something, you see a website, they get paid per click from their advertisers. And that, even if we were to stop making pornography now, and we never made any more pornographic material, there'd still be enough for you to watch every day for the rest of your life. Just think about that, just the sheer volume. So it's not just a matter of production, it's a matter of sort of propagation. And now what we've got is, we've got a world where, we could cure smoking tomorrow by just not letting people grow tobacco. I mean, eventually the tobacco stores would run out, right? But that's just it. This is information. This is media, and so it can be stored. It can be stored on multiple sites. Some of these gateway sites, these tube sites, actually they're all networked together. It's actually one company that owns the vast majority of all of these different sites that we think are actually different sites. But their job is to funnel traffic back and forth to each other, and there's a small number that actually are sort of producing their own material. And so for people who kind of get bored with the free stuff, they may find themselves interested in a particular actress or a particular genre. That's actually a small amount of money that's being generated anymore. Back when we were bailing everyone out, right, the banks and all that stuff, after the last election, the pornography industry actually had the audacity to suggest that they needed to be bailed out because of all of, you can go down to Best Buy and buy your own video camera and make your own pornography and upload it to a tube site as amateur porn. So now people are sort of making their own stuff and uploading it. As an industry, it's sort of reaching a point where, like with Playboy magazine, it's kind of cannibalizing itself because it's creating a culture of people who see themselves as sexual objects to be engaged in self-exploitation. Or even thinking about some of the more recent trends about, it's commonplace now for young couples to think, yeah, let's make a porn of ourselves. Let's videotape ourselves, having sex. And they keep it supposedly for their own, benefit, for each other. I don't know, personally, I'd much rather, be intimate with my wife than to watch a movie of us being intimate. So I don't quite get the logic of that, but that's just me seeing the dress as black and blue. But some people kind of, there's a movie. Like, wasn't there a couple, somebody and somebody made a porn, or Sex Tape, I think was another movie that came out a couple years ago. That's kind of like, we think like this is part of what you do in order to spice up your sex life, and then you split up because you're much more prone to do that anyway, because you're embedded in a way of thinking about sexuality that doesn't bring you together. It actually makes you more selfish in your sexuality. And then whoever's got the tape uploads it to a revenge porn site. So it's just even thinking about the new ways that we find of exploiting each other and being cruel to each other and sort of exploiting sexuality. I have great sympathy and empathy for your generation. You should have never been asked to come of age under these circumstances. I love the internet. I love all that it does for science and for getting people connected. But this is one incredibly dark side that is now beginning to bloom. and you're seeing it in people's broken sexuality, bad ways of thinking about sexuality. And I would like to, if I can, in lieu of any questions that are popping up. Oh yeah, in the back.
Well, to answer your question, I think it was interesting like the mechanism by which pornography leads to increased sexual abuse. And like intuitively, it doesn't surprise me that it does, but I think it's good to hear like the more scientifically studied link between when people start to think that they are expected to act in that way. That is a direct link between porn and sexual abuse, and I think it's really relevant because like sexual abuse, especially on college campuses, is such an important issue to people right now. And if this is a talk about sexual abuse, there are probably dozens or like 100 students here. And to me, it seems like it is, or at least very much so, a talk about why one of the reasons sexual abuse is prevalent. And I hope like that's something that gets publicized more, and that the university starts to see this or this kind of information as something that can be done. It's not like a different problem; it's the same problem. So I think those links are really interesting.
Well, let's just kind of think about this for a second. I mean, one of the things that I alluded to, I didn't get to unpack nearly as well, is this notion of, within us we have this sort of mirroring neurological system. That when I do something that, as me kind of doing this, right, you all kind of could figure out how to do this, right, just by watching me do this, right? And maybe, okay, that's kind of weird. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone do anything like that before, right? This is my new dance move. Okay, we'll just call it that. Well, when you think about this mirror system, actually what happens is the neurological systems in you that would be active if you were to do this are activated just by watching it. And so we mirror each other neurologically. And so we vicariously experience what we see. So when I'm doing this, you are also neurologically doing this, but you're holding it in check. But you now know how to do this. You may have never seen this dance move before, but any one of you are now going to be predisposed to doing it, maybe on a lark, right? Because you've seen something. What you see, you now do. And when we think about the amount of sexual violence that we see, or aggression that we see in pornography, I would never think of smacking my wife in the middle of a sexually intimate encounter. That's commonplace in sexuality. Smacking the person's backside, right? Or slapping them in the face, or slapping their genitals. That's commonplace. I mean, that's what these content analysis things do. The language that we use, how people talk in degrading fashion to one another. I mean, we see that and we hear that, and now it's as if we didn't go into watching the porn hoping for that to happen, but you've in many ways have been neurologically violated because of what you've seen. You didn't consent to it, but it's almost as if your mind has been sexually assaulted because of what you've seen. And so now what you see, you are now more predisposed to experiment with. So it is actually a sexual violence issue. It's the way you're groomed for sexual violence. Yes?
Do you have any studies that have shown like some sort of like the relation between maybe how long someone has viewed pornography and then how long it takes for them to get over it? Are there any studies like that?
Less about how long it takes for them to get over it, and a lot of it depends on what your criterion is for recovery. So for example, if we're going to say getting over it's like 1 year. Other people, their criteria is, well, we want to see change in brain, activity. That's kind of what we're looking at in our lab. That's a long process, by the way, and you can't guarantee that someone who's in therapy is actually going to recover. But thinking about kind of these notions about duration, we do see that the increased amount of time used. That's the Voon study that I mentioned. Looking at the more pornography you view, the smaller the right putamen becomes. The more dysfunctional the orbitofrontal circuit becomes as well, the more impulsive you are. So, and also keep in mind, there are many different reasons for why people are viewing pornography. And if you're an impulsive person, or a person who, for example, is viewing pornography because they're depressed, versus a person who is, can't stop thinking about sex, we wouldn't come to all of those people and try the same intervention any more than we would try and use the same intervention for someone with attention deficit disorder who's impulsive, a person who's clinically depressed, or a person who has obsessive compulsive disorder. And each of those trajectories for those disorders, which could be reasons why people are looking for porn, will vary based on where they're located neurologically. The more to the cortex you are, the more plastic, the more fluid, the more rapid you can kind of change that circuit. The deeper you get down into the limbic system, or even down to the diencephalon, to hypothalamic issues, or even kind of getting back into sort of cerebellar issues, those are things that don't really change quickly. So they require a lot more time for you to establish new patterns.
Any other questions?
Why is there so much pornography that is so aggressive and degrading? Why is that so common or prevalent instead of, I don't know, like couples just being nice to each other and maybe making love more than this very aggressive form? What do you think that's good?
Well, kind of how I was explaining how people become bored with the same kind of material, and they're seeking that rush, like that adrenaline, the dopamine that's being released in the brain also. And so you have to, this is like really in a lot of different material, not just pornography, but you seek the novel, you seek the new. And so it's just digressed to this point. You know, it used to be people, it used to be just topless women. Then it was people who were just kind of having normal sex. Now this really deviant type of sex has become completely normalized because that's what people have craved over the years as they've changed.
And I think there is something about viewing violence that actually causes us to become physically aroused. This is why action films are so huge in our country. Right? We love seeing stuff get blown up. We love seeing people fight. Right? We've got a whole industry of mixed martial arts where people just, they pay big money to watch two people beat each other up. And I think that's because of this, once again, this sort of neurological disposition that we have to identify with one another. And so we can identify as the person who is doing the beating up or the person who's being beaten up, and that will trigger an autonomic arousal in us. And for many individuals, that heightened autonomic arousal can actually give them a little more of an edge in their sexual arousal and their sexual climax. So that's one reason. I think another reason is also going to be many men will find themselves very frustrated with women, that women don't give sex on demand. And so what happens is there's this sort of sexual tension, and especially if you're cultivating an environment where men feel entitled to sex, then what happens is when they don't get it in the real world, well, that can frustrate them and they can go to the pornography. And I saw someone wrote something about all pornography is revenge porn. That pornography inherently has a misogynistic flavor to it.
Even the kind produced by women.
Yeah, and so what happens is it sort of appeals to this sort of subcortical, subconscious, just below the surface simmering anger towards women. And it sort of provides them a way of maybe getting back at being rejected. So I think there's something to explore there. I'm a brain scientist, so we're talking like psychodynamic Freudian stuff, so I'm completely out of my league. But I do think there is something about men sort of feeling frustrated and feeling, okay, here's a woman I can have whenever I want. Yeah, we can go ahead and slap her around. That makes me feel good, like I'm getting back at the woman in the real world who is not giving me what I want. And so I do think that that's why you see there's a lot of this sort of element of misogyny in a lot of the pornography. And when that kind of just reaches its logical conclusion, then you can get to, obviously clear violence and aggression towards women, which verbal violence, not just sort of physical violence or sexual violence, but that's why I'd say in addition to what Dawn had mentioned.
I want to just add to that too, that softcore images or less violent images also have a lot of these same effects. I mean, when we were kind of spewing out all this research and data to you guys, it wasn't that stuff is only extremely violent hardcore pornography that's eliciting those responses, but softcore images also can be quite damaging as well.
All right, so we're out of time. Thank you again to our speakers for coming, and thank you all for